In the years after the Chernobyl disaster, biologists moving through the exclusion zone began to encounter a scene that seemed to belong to two different stories at once. Apartment blocks stood empty, windows broken, paint lifting from the walls, roads cracked, trees pressed against concrete. And yet in the same landscape, cameras and field surveys recorded elk, boar, foxes, and wolves moving through spaces once crowded with human routine. It was the kind of image that lingers in the mind because it feels like an answer before the question has even been fully asked. Picture yourself standing at the edge of that silence. Not the silence of untouched wilderness, but the silence of a place that has lost its operators. No traffic, no voices, no lights in the windows. At first glance, it is easy to feel that familiar thought rise almost on its own. If we were gone, the earth would simply return to itself. Forests would advance, animals would come back, and the world, relieved of us, would begin to heal. It is a beautiful idea, and for that reason, it is also a dangerous one. Because beauty can make a story feel true long before science has tested it. What researchers slowly discovered in exclusion zones, abandoned landscapes, ecological field sites, climate records, and the hidden logic of modern infrastructure was something far more complicated. A world without humans would not unfold in a single direction. Some things would fail within hours, not centuries. Some dangers would remain active after the people who built them were gone. Some species would spread. Others, shaped by our food, our waste, and our cities, might falter. And even where green life returned most visibly, the deeper record of human presence could remain in the atmosphere, in altered soils, in extinctions, in plastics, and in the rock record itself. So, the question is not only what the world would look like if we vanished. The harder question is what exactly we have been doing to this planet all along, often without noticing it. If humanity disappeared tomorrow, what would truly return? What would break, and what would go on carrying our trace long after we were gone? Before any argument begins, before any scientist arrives with measurements or warnings or theories, there is only the image. A city at dawn with no one in it, not destroyed, not burning, not buried under some sudden ruin, but simply absent of us. The traffic lights keep changing above empty intersections. A newspaper, never collected, darkens under a thin fall of rain. Somewhere in the distance, a door swings gently against its frame because no hand is left to close it. You can almost hear the strange enlargement of sound that comes when the usual human layer has been removed. A bird call travels farther. Wind seems to move with more authority. Water dripping from a broken gutter begins to sound less like background and more like a kind of clock. The first sensation is not terror, it is relief. The scene feels as though the world has finally been allowed to exhale. Stay there for a moment. At the threshold of that quiet, the streets are still recognizable. The buildings still hold their shape. Storefront glass reflects the pale sky, yet something in the balance has already shifted. Without footsteps, engines, radios, voices, screens, and the 1,000 unremarked signals by which people announce themselves. The city begins to look less like a fixed achievement and more like a temporary arrangement that has paused between one state and another. A weed leans through a crack at the edge of the curb. Pigeons gather where cars would normally pass. A distant fox crosses a road built for speed and seems to belong to it with a confidence that feels almost insulting. And with that image comes the thought that has seduced so many modern imaginations. If we disappeared, perhaps the earth would simply return to itself. Perhaps forests would move back in. Rivers would find their way. Animals would reclaim what had always been theirs. And all the pressure of human striving would loosen at last. It is an appealing vision because it offers both punishment and comfort in the same breath. We vanish, and the world goes on. More than that, it goes on beautifully. The fantasy satisfies something moral as well as aesthetic. It suggests that beneath the noise of civilization, there has always been a quieter order waiting patiently for us to step aside. In that sense, the empty city is never just an empty city. It becomes a parable. The vines climbing the walls do not merely grow. They seem to correct. The silence does not merely descend. It appears to heal. Even people who would never say such things aloud often feel them when they stand among ruins or see photographs of abandoned stations, empty schools, houses half taken by moss and weather. There is often a private, almost embarrassing sense that the world looks not worse in our absence, but strangely more itself. Long before modern environmental science gave us formal language for ecosystems, pollution, climate, and extinction, Western art and literature had already learned how to make that feeling legible. 18th century Europe developed a fascination with ruins so intense that wealthy landowners built artificial ones in their gardens, as though a complete landscape required some visible reminder of time's victory over ambition. Paintings by artists such as Hubert Robert lingered on broken arches, collapsed temples, and vegetation drifting back through stone. Later, in poetry and prose, ruins became places where human power could be admired and humbled at once. What mattered in these images was not only destruction, it was the mood that arrived after destruction, when noise had drained away and nature, or what looked like nature, seemed to resume a patient occupation of the scene. Even when the subjects were ancient Rome or imaginary monuments, the emotional lesson was modern. Human works are temporary. The world is older, calmer, and waiting. That old romance of ruins would eventually merge with a newer and far more unsettling awareness. In the 19th century, as industry, railroads, urban growth, and imperial expansion transformed landscapes at a scale that earlier centuries had scarcely imagined, a few observers began to recognize that humanity was not merely building on top of nature, it was rearranging it. Among the clearest voices in that awakening was George Perkins Marsh, a diplomat, philologist, restless scholar, and one of those unusually wide minds who seem to notice patterns because they have trained themselves to live across many fields at once. Marsh had traveled, read deeply, and watched the marks of human use on forests, watersheds, soils, and climates. In 1864, when he published Man and Nature, he did something quietly radical. He described human beings not simply as inhabitants of the earth, but as agents capable of altering whole systems. Deforestation, erosion, the changing flow of water, the exhaustion of land. These were not isolated local mishaps. They belonged to a larger story about what civilization does when it forgets that the ground beneath it is alive and limited. Marsh was not writing a fantasy of human disappearance. In a way, he was writing against a deeper fantasy. The old confidence that nature would endlessly absorb whatever people demanded of it. Yet his work also helped make the later thought experiment possible. Once you begin to see human activity as a force that reshapes the world at scale, another question soon follows. If our presence matters so much, then what would our absence mean? Would the systems we altered rebound? Would the damage fade? Would the forest return to some earlier form? Or had civilization already changed the terms too deeply for any simple return to be possible? Marsh did not answer those questions in the manner of a modern documentary or ecological model, but he helped create the intellectual ground on which they could later be asked seriously. He taught readers to look at riverbanks, hillsides, and timbered slopes and see history written in physical form. If Marsh made the damage visible in the landscape, Rachel Carson later taught millions of readers to sense a different kind of disturbance, one that could not be recognized so easily by the eye. When Silent Spring appeared in 1962, Carson did not open with a graph or a laboratory procedure. She opened with a fable of a town where spring had gone wrong, where birds no longer sang, where a season that should have announced life arrived with an unnatural hush. It was a brilliant decision because it began not with a technical claim, but with a mood, an absence, a silence. The silence was imagined, but the science beneath it was not. Carson showed that modern human power often works in ways too dispersed, too chemical, too delayed, and too invisible for ordinary intuition to grasp. Sprayed compounds moved through fields and streams and bodies. Harm traveled without spectacle. Damage accumulated beyond the boundaries of the place where it began. In one sense, Carson's work deepened the same moral feeling that had always lived inside the image of ruins. Human action could wound the more than human world, but it also complicated the fantasy of easy release. If harm can be invisible while humans are present, then traces of that harm may remain even after humans are gone. This is one reason the empty world remains so fascinating. It promises simplicity at the very moment science has made simplicity harder to believe. The image says one thing at first glance: quiet streets, green growth, animal movement, whether on stone, a planet relaxing. But the historical development of environmental thought keeps whispering that the visible surface may mislead. The world we inhabit is not merely covered by human structures. It is threaded through with human decisions, human chemistry, human transport, human extraction, human waste, human rearrangements of soil and water and fire and species. Even our categories begin to blur under pressure. What counts as nature in a field shaped by centuries of grazing? What counts as wild in a forest whose composition has been altered by logging, burning, or imported pathogens? What counts as recovery in a river whose course was redirected generations ago? Once those questions enter the scene, the old fantasy does not vanish, but it begins to look less like a truth and more like a longing. That longing became especially vivid in the 20th and 21st centuries through a new category of place: the human landscape left behind. Abandoned factories, depopulated villages, exclusion zones, old military sites, empty stations, sealed neighborhoods, districts evacuated after contamination or economic collapse. All these places seem to offer glimpses of the future we imagine in the thought experiment. They are irresistible to photographers because they combine familiarity with estrangement. A classroom with vines at the window, an apartment block with trees rising beside its stairwells, a swimming pool full of leaves, a road softening under grasses, and then, almost inevitably, an animal crossing the frame. Deer in a suburb, boar in a derelict town, fish in a canal that once carried only industrial runoff. These scenes appear to answer the question before science has even begun. They tell us that when human use recedes, life comes back. And often, visibly, it does. That is why the fantasy survives. It is not built entirely on illusion. The difficulty is that the eye is such a persuasive witness, especially when it sees what it wants to see. A greener world feels like a healthier one. Silence feels like peace. Animals moving through an abandoned space feel like justice. Yet the history of science is full of moments when appearances, especially attractive appearances, concealed more complicated processes underneath. Early astronomers looked at the heavens and saw fixed perfection until motion revealed instability. Physicians once read symptoms as isolated events until deeper causal systems were uncovered. Ecologists themselves would later argue bitterly over whether a landscape returning after disturbance was really moving toward a stable order or simply passing through a contingent sequence of temporary arrangements. Again and again, beauty has not always been false, but it has often been incomplete. There is also something psychologically revealing in the popularity of the humanless world. It lets modern people imagine release not only for the planet, but from themselves. The fantasy of a silent Earth often appears during times of overcrowding, exhaustion, pollution, noise, technological acceleration, and urban stress. It is hard not to hear, inside the scenario, a hidden fatigue. What if all the pressure stopped? What if deadlines, engines, extraction, alarms, and endless maintenance gave way to weather, season, and patient biological time? The image carries a dream of rest. That dream can be ecological, but it can also be personal. In imagining the world without us, we sometimes smuggle in a wish to be free of the tempo we ourselves created. The calm of the abandoned city is not only botanical, it is psychological. That may be why the image often arrives with such force at night, or in those quiet hours when cities seem temporarily to reveal their bones. You walk down a nearly empty street after rain. Store signs are dark. Offices have emptied. A few windows still glow. But the avenue feels less like a machine and more like a shell. In that softened hour, it becomes easier to sense what daytime normally conceals. That human order is not a permanent condition, but an active effort. The pavement stays clear because crews clear it. The lights remain on because networks are balanced. Water runs because pumps turn. Waste disappears because systems carry it away. Food arrives because supply chains continue moving under their own enormous burden of scheduling, labor, and fuel. But in the fantasy we have been considering, all of that work is hidden. The city appears as an object, not as a performance. And that concealment is part of the lie. Still, the lie is beautiful enough that we should not dismiss it too quickly. Beauty, even when partial, often tells us what kind of question we are really asking. The image of nature returning through our absence carries at least one truth worth preserving. It reminds us that the human world has never stood outside the living world. It altered. Plants are already waiting in cracks. Fungi are already threading through foundations. Seeds drift constantly onto surfaces we call built. Birds nest in the margins of our order. Foxes, coyotes, boar, monkeys, macaque, gulls, rats, crows, deer, all over the world. Creatures have learned to live near us, around us, despite us, and sometimes because of us. The boundary between city and habitat was always more porous than our maps suggested. The fantasy matters because it makes that porosity visible. It gives shape to the intuition that our arrangements are neither final nor absolute. But the same image becomes misleading when it persuades us that absence and recovery are the same thing. To disappear is not merely to stop disturbing. It is also to stop managing, repairing, cooling, balancing, pumping, containing, feeding, and noticing. The silence that first appears so peaceful may conceal processes already moving toward disorder. The green shoot in the pavement may indeed be the sign of one world returning. Yet nearby, unseen systems may be drifting toward failure with a speed and consequence the eye cannot yet register. That is the threshold on which this documentary begins, not between civilization and wilderness in any simple sense, but between the image we love and the reality we have not yet learned to hear. So let the scene remain before us a little longer. The empty boulevard, the rain on glass, the grass beginning at the curb, the sense that the earth, relieved of human pressure, is preparing to take a long, slow breath. It is an image strong enough to survive centuries of art, literature, photography, and environmental longing because it satisfies something deep in the imagination. It lets time become visible. It lets arrogance soften into humility. It lets the built world seem briefly fragile, and the non-human world patient, enduring, serene. It is, in its way, one of the most beautiful stories modern people tell about themselves. And like many beautiful stories, it becomes more interesting the moment it starts to break, because beneath that first stillness lies another truth, quieter at first but far more decisive. The world we are picturing does not simply become empty when humans vanish. It becomes unattended, and unattended things do not remain suspended in graceful silence for long. Beneath the calm streets, inside the walls, along the power lines, in the tunnels, pipes, reactors, levees, substations, pumps, and control rooms, another clock has already begun to move. That hidden clock begins moving long before vines reach the windows or roots begin lifting the pavement. At first, almost nothing seems to happen. The skyline still holds. The avenues remain where they were. The city, in those earliest hours, can look eerily preserved, as if absence were only a delay in the morning routine. Yet what has actually disappeared is not just the human figure within the scene. It is the continuous stream of small corrections that kept the scene from changing. A valve is no longer checked. A switch is no longer reset. A pump continues until it does not. A warning light flashes into an empty room. What we call stability turns out to have been a living process all along. This is one of the oldest illusions of modern life. We are surrounded by systems so reliable that they begin to look like features of nature. Light arrives when we touch a switch. Water rises in pipes and comes clear from a tap. Waste leaves without ceremony. Streets remain drivable. Tunnels stay dry. Refrigeration holds the night inside a metal box. So much of ordinary experience depends on these quiet successes that we rarely see them as achievements unfolding minute by minute. We see only the finished surface. The city appears as an object, when in truth it is closer to a performance, held together by repeated acts of adjustment, inspection, cleaning, repair, and control. That way of living is relatively new in human history. Large ancient cities had always required upkeep. But the modern city became something more demanding. During the 19th century, industrial growth and urban crowding forced governments, engineers, and public health reformers to think at a different scale. Waterworks had to be extended, sewage carried away, refuse removed, streets lit, disease contained. Beneath the visible architecture of boulevards, stations, apartment blocks, and offices, another architecture was built, one made of pipes, mains, pumps, drains, tunnels, cables, switching equipment, reservoir, depots, valves, and service schedules. It did not ask to be admired. Its success depended on being ignored. When everything worked, the hidden city stayed hidden. You can feel that hidden city most clearly in the brief moments when it falters. A power cut in the middle of an ordinary evening does not merely darken a room. It reveals a chain of dependence that had been present all along. Elevators stop. Ventilation stills. Screens go black. Traffic lights fail. Refrigerators become sealed clocks of slow spoilage. Phone batteries begin their short descent towards silence. The same principle applies at a larger scale. Engineers learned, especially in the 20th century, that networks become more efficient and more useful as they interconnect, but also more delicate in ways that are difficult to see from the outside. A power grid is not simply a storehouse of electricity waiting to be handed out. It is a balancing act, performed in real time, with generation and demand constantly kept in relationship. Frequency, voltage, load, reserve margin, transmission constraints, all have to be managed in motion. That is why the disappearance of people would not begin, electrically speaking, as a neat theatrical blackout in which every light on Earth goes out at once. Some generating stations would trip automatically. Protective relays would isolate faults. Emergency power would hold for a while in certain places. Other parts of the network would continue briefly, or island themselves for a time, then fail as fuel was exhausted, components overheated, or controls drifted beyond tolerances no one remained to correct. The history of blackouts taught engineers and planners just how dynamic these networks really were. The Great Northeast Blackout of 1965, and later the North American Blackout of 2003, showed that disruptions could propagate through systems with startling speed. A local fault could become regional darkness, but those events also revealed something else. Recovery depended on crews, operators, dispatchers, switching sequences, field checks, communication, and human judgment under pressure. In the world we are imagining, the second half of that story never arrives. There is no restoration phase. So the early post-human city would darken unevenly. Some neighborhoods would fall silent quickly. Others would remain lit for a strange and temporary interval, as if refusing to accept what had happened. Airports might glow without passengers. Hospital generators would take over, then run until their fuel ran out or their machinery demanded attention no one could provide. Server farms would keep their fans spinning a little longer. Batteries would sustain alarms. Control panels, emergency signage, and backup systems that had been designed with interruption in mind, not abandonment. If you could move through that city in the first day, it would not feel like a single event. It would feel like continuity thinning in patches. Water would follow close behind. Modern urban life has always depended on a kind of managed invisibility in which immense quantities of water are captured, filtered, treated, pressurized, lifted. stored, and delivered without most people ever thinking about the journey. That invisible confidence was built gradually. 19th century cities learned through repeated disease outbreaks that proximity alone was not the problem. Contaminated water and inadequate sanitation could turn density into catastrophe. The sanitary revolutions that followed in cities across Europe and North America were among the great infrastructural achievements of the modern world. Reservoir, pumping stations, treatment plants, filtration systems, chlorination, sewer networks, all became part of the silent promise that the city could remain habitable at large scale. Yet none of that promise is self-sustaining. Pumps need power. Treatment plants need operators, chemical supplies, monitoring, and calibration. Pressure has to be maintained. Valves must be controlled. Without that ongoing attention, the miracle begins to reverse. Taps continue to run only until gravity, storage, and residual pressure have spent themselves. Then faucets cough and fall quiet. Toilets stop clearing. Wastewater stations stall. Low-lying areas begin to experience the first signs of backup. Rivers that once received carefully managed discharge start receiving something less orderly. The disappearance of maintenance is not abstract here. It enters kitchens, stairwells, basements, hospitals, hotels, schools, and apartments through smell, dryness, stagnation, and overflow. Fire belongs to the same hidden order. We tend to think of buildings as shelter, as fixed enclosures that passively protect what lies inside them. But the modern building is also a carefully regulated climate with layers of prevention built into it. Sprinkler systems require water pressure. Fire alarms assume someone will come. Smoke extraction systems depend on power. Fire doors must close properly. Emergency lighting must function. Small accidents are made survivable by a whole culture of inspection and response. Without that culture, the meaning of a spark changes. A neglected kitchen flame, a damaged transformer, a generator fault, a lightning strike on a dry structure. Any of these can begin a process that, in an inhabited city, would have been limited quickly. Now it moves under new conditions, sometimes flaring, sometimes dying, always without intervention. Even the underground spaces of the city, those places most people enter only to pass through, reveal how intensely the modern built environment depends on being tended. Subways are a clear example. Many great transit systems fight a daily and unglamorous battle against groundwater. Water seeps through rock, along joints, through aging concrete, around utility penetrations, and into tunnels that remain usable only because pumps remove what geology steadily offers back. The same is true of underpasses, service corridors, utility vaults, basements, and cable chambers. The city is often imagined as a triumph over the landscape beneath it. But in practical terms, it is usually an extended negotiation with gravity, seepage, and pressure. Once the pumps stop, that negotiation begins to fail, not as a sudden cinematic flood in every instance, but as accumulation, one low place at a time. There are entire districts in the world where dry land is maintained by comparable effort. Coastal cities protected by levees, floodgates, drainage canals, and pumping systems do not simply rest above the water. They persist there because institutions, engineers, and maintenance crews work ceaselessly to keep the boundary intact. The modern history of flood control, from river engineering to storm protection, is a history of learning how temporary dryness can be when vigilance lapses. Storms, subsidence, sediment shifts, overtopping, seepage, structural fatigue, all taught the same lesson repeatedly. Barriers do not merely stand, they are managed. In a humanless world, no one is inspecting for weak spots, clearing intakes, fueling pumps, or deciding when to open and close gates. In some places, the return of water would begin long before the return of forest. Waste, too, would stop moving away from us. One of the subtle accomplishments of modern urban life is that it teaches people not to think about where things go once they have been discarded, flushed, swept aside, or bagged for collection. Removal is built into the rhythm of the day. Trucks arrive, sewers carry, treatment plants process, landfills receive, incinerators burn. The social effect is powerful. A city can appear far cleaner than its underlying metabolism would suggest because its byproducts are constantly being displaced in time and space. But when that rhythm breaks, accumulation becomes local again. Bags remain where they were left. Food spoils in warehouses and storefronts. Cooling fails in storage facilities. Wastewater settles where it should have flowed on. The city begins to experience its own output directly. This is the point at which engineers, emergency planners, and reliability specialists would not be surprised, even if the scenario itself remained impossible outside imagination. For much of the 20th century, and especially after major failures, they learned to think less in terms of isolated systems than in terms of dependency chains. Electricity supports communications. Communications support dispatch. Dispatch depends on data. Data depends on servers, cooling, backup power, and telecommunications. Fuel needs transport. Transport depends on roads, signals, staffing, and maintenance. Water helps cool industrial systems. Industrial systems help supply power. Each layer rests on other layers, many of which are easy to overlook until they are gone. Hurricanes, blackouts, floods, winter storms, and industrial accidents repeatedly exposed these hidden couplings. The lesson was never that civilization is flimsy in some childish sense. It was that resilience has to be worked at continuously because complexity multiplies the number of things that can quietly depend on one another. There is also a human story inside that realization, one the modern world is not always good at honoring. Maintenance is rarely glamorous. It belongs to morning shifts, night shifts, inspections, manuals, checklists, custodial rounds, pressure readings, lubrication schedules, filter changes, corrosion surveys, calibration routines, drainage clearing, software updates, line patrols, replacement parts, and all the other forms of care that do not look like grand invention. Yet these routines are among the deepest expressions of civilization because they acknowledge a truth that older dreams of permanence often tried to deny. Everything drifts. Everything degrades. Systems remain safe and useful only because somebody returns, again and again, to hold them within bounds. The people who perform that work are often invisible when they succeed. The post-human world makes them visible by their absence. At the scale of the home, the same pattern repeats in smaller gestures. A gutter would normally be cleared before leaves compact into a dam. A roof leak would be patched before rot moved into the rafters. A thermostat would be adjusted. A battery replaced. A sump pump tested. A window latched before a storm. A refrigerator door fully shut. A drain unclogged. A pipe insulated. These are not grand feats of engineering. Yet together they form the domestic equivalent of infrastructure. The inhabited world survives through habits of noticing. Remove those habits, and even sturdy places begin to slide toward change. The first post-human day may still feel uncannily intact, but by then, countless minor failures are already waiting in line. This is why the fantasy of the empty world is so incomplete. It imagines absence as stillness, when in practice absence sets processes loose. Darkness arrives in stages. Water pressure ebbs. Low spaces dampen. Temperatures drift indoors. Stored cold weakens. Monitoring stops. Warnings accumulate unanswered. Mechanical parts continue in motion until wear, fault, lack of fuel, or lack of cooling brings them down. Many of these failures are not dramatic. They are administrative failures of the physical world. The quiet undoing of routines no one noticed were essential. And because they are quiet, they would be easy to mistake, from a distance, for peace. But some inheritances are different. Some of the things we built do not merely go still when they are neglected. They go on holding pressure, heat, toxicity, stored energy, or concentrated risk in ways that depend even more heavily on watchfulness. Up to this point, we have been moving through the systems whose failure would darken, flood, starve, clog, and unmake the managed surfaces of daily life. The path ahead leads toward another category altogether, one in which silence does not cancel danger. And the disappearance of the operator may be the beginning of a more troubling kind of continuation. A nuclear plant, seen from a distance, can look almost serene. The cooling towers release their pale plumes into the sky. The containment buildings sit with a kind of deliberate heaviness, as though they were designed to reassure by their very shape. Even the language that grew up around them often borrowed from order and control. Containment, shielding, regulation, redundancy. Yet among all the systems modern civilization has built, few make the difference between presence and absence more unsettlingly clear. Because here, when the operators vanish, the machinery does not simply fall silent and become harmless. In one of the most important technical lessons of the atomic age, shutdown never meant cold. That was not discovered late. Engineers understood from the beginning that once uranium atoms had been split and the fuel had accumulated a dense population of radioactive fission products, heat would continue to be produced even after the controlled chain reaction was stopped. But the broader public imagination often attached nuclear danger to the instant of crisis. The burst, the blast, the runaway event. Civilian nuclear power, especially in its early decades, was presented in a very different register. This was the atom domesticated. The same deep energy that had once appeared over Hiroshima and Nagasaki now redirected into grids, suburbs, factories, and evening light. In the optimistic years of post-war nuclear development, atomic energy could be spoken of almost as a symbol of modern adulthood, proof that human beings had reached a level of technical maturity great enough to discipline one of nature's most concentrated forces. Inside the field itself, the mood was never quite so innocent. Reactor design began with a difficult truth. Once the control rods are inserted and the sustained fission reaction is halted, the fuel does not relax into inactivity. The unstable fragments left behind continue to decay, and that decay continues to produce heat. In the first moments after shutdown, the proportion may be far smaller than full operating power, but it is still immense in absolute terms, more than enough to damage fuel if cooling is lost. This is why a reactor does not move from operation to safety in a single step. It moves from one demanding condition into another. The first phase is power production. The second is heat removal. Remove the people. And the distinction begins to matter in a frighteningly practical way. The architecture of nuclear safety was built around that distinction. Pumps must circulate coolant, valves must open and close correctly. Backup power must be available if off-site electricity disappears. Instrumentation must tell the truth clearly enough that operators understand the state of the core under stress. Procedures must be rehearsed, updated, questioned, and sometimes rewritten in light of what earlier incidents revealed. Over time, the nuclear industry developed a safety philosophy built on layers, physical barriers, engineered systems, emergency diesels, battery banks, operator training, regulatory review, accident analysis, probabilistic risk assessment, severe accident management. All were meant to ensure that no single failure could easily open a path toward catastrophe. It was a formidable apparatus, and in many respects a sober one, but it never escaped its central dependence. At the end of all that engineering stood the expectation that someone would still be there. That expectation was sharpened by accidents that changed how the field thought about its own vulnerabilities. 3 Mile Island in 1979 was one such turning point. The reactor shut down, as it was supposed to, but a combination of equipment malfunction, design issues, and misleading instrumentation contributed to a partial core meltdown. The event became a defining lesson in human factors. Operators were not careless caricatures in a morality tale. They were working within a situation in which the plant was giving incomplete or confusing signals about what was happening internally. One of the enduring legacies of 3 Mile Island was the recognition that a severe accident could emerge not only from violent external disruption, but from ambiguity inside a highly complex system. A plant could be shut down and still move toward danger. In the years that followed, training, control room design, emergency procedures, and the study of operator response all took on a different seriousness. This was part of a larger historical shift in how advanced technology was understood. Early nuclear confidence often spoke in the language of mastery. Later nuclear safety culture spoke more often in the language of vigilance. Analysts began to focus on low-probability combinations, on common cause failures, on the ways multiple protective layers could be undermined together. One phrase came to carry unusual weight in this thinking: station blackout. It sounds technical and oddly modest, but behind it lies one of the clearest nightmares in reactor safety. A station blackout means the loss of off-site electric power combined with the failure, unavailability, or exhaustion of on-site emergency AC power. In simpler terms, the plant loses the energy needed to keep crucial cooling systems going. The grid is gone. The backup lifeline is gone. The reactor may be shut down, but the decay heat remains. For years, this was treated as a serious but bounded contingency. The sort of condition engineers model, regulators evaluate, and plant designers prepare against with multiple backups. Then, in March 2011, Fukushima Daiichi showed the world what prolonged loss of power and cooling could mean in reality. The earthquake triggered automatic shutdown of the operating reactors. In a narrow sense, the first emergency action worked. The plant scrammed. Then the tsunami arrived. It disabled off-site power and flooded emergency diesel generators. Batteries provided temporary support, but time, in such a situation, is never abstract. It drains away with the charge. Cooling could not be sustained. Core damage followed. Hydrogen explosions tore through reactor buildings. The sequence was sobering precisely because it did not begin with a reactor refusing to stop. It began with a reactor stopping. And with that not being enough, Fukushima changed public imagination. But it also changed professional imagination. It forced a deeper reckoning with extended loss of power, with the placement and protection of emergency equipment, with flooding risk, with filtered venting, with mobile backup systems, with the need to think beyond tidy assumptions about how long support systems would remain available. The event was not a generic symbol of nuclear danger. It was a lesson in duration. Safety could not be imagined only as the ability to handle the first shock. It had to include the long aftermath, the hours and days in which a plant still demanded water, electricity, instrumentation, access, judgment, and improvisation. In the world we are imagining here, that aftermath would begin everywhere at once, and nowhere would anyone arrive to help. This is the point at which a humanless Earth becomes especially difficult to picture honestly. Popular imagination often drifts toward one of two extremes. Either every nuclear facility on the planet erupts at once in a chain of cinematic catastrophe, or the reactors simply switch themselves off and fade quietly from concern. Neither picture fits the engineering reality. Reactors would likely behave differently depending on their design, their operational state at the moment of disappearance, the availability of passive safety features, the resilience of backup systems, the local geography, the condition of equipment, and the inventories of fuel on site. Some would shut down and remain comparatively stable for a time. Others would move into more dangerous territory as cooling was lost and no one restored it. The differences matter because the post-human world would be uneven from the first minute. Yet the broader principle remains. Automatic systems can begin the response. They cannot complete it indefinitely. Spent fuel complicates the picture further. Even after fuel assemblies are removed from a reactor core, they remain intensely radioactive and thermally active for years. Many are stored in pools where water serves both as coolant and shielding. Those pools do not pose the same immediate dynamics as an operating reactor, but they are still part of the larger logic of residual danger. Water levels matter. Heat loads matter. The integrity of circulation and makeup systems matters over longer timescales. Older fuel can be transferred into dry cask storage, which is far more passively secure, and one reason the post-human nuclear future would not be uniform. Dry casks are designed to stand without pumps or active cooling. They are one of the few places in this landscape where the engineer's dream of safe stillness approaches something real. But not all material reaches that state at the same pace. And not all sites hold the same mixture of active reactors, spent fuel pools, fresh fuel, waste streams, and support systems. Silence, again, does not erase complexity. Nuclear facilities are only the clearest expression of a wider truth. Industrial civilization stores danger in concentrated forms. Chemical plants hold toxic gases and reactive feedstocks. Refineries contain flammable hydrocarbons under pressure. Pipelines move enormous inventories across large distances with the aid of compressors, valves, sensors, and remote monitoring. Tailings ponds, waste lagoons, and storage tanks sit behind embankments and containment systems that rely on inspection and maintenance more than casual observers ever see. One of the enduring lessons of industrial accidents has been that catastrophic release often comes from a chain of ordinary neglect. Seveso in 1976, Bhopal in 1984, countless smaller leaks, fires, ruptures, and contaminations taught the same uncomfortable principle. The hazard is not always in dramatic misuse. Very often it lies in what happens when warning systems are disabled. Maintenance lapses, protective layers are bypassed, or a site drifts outside the narrow conditions under which it remains safe. Bhopal is especially haunting in this respect. The gas release in India was not an analog for humanity's disappearance, but it remains one of the starkest reminders that industrial toxicity can sit quietly inside routine until a convergence of neglected safeguards turns stored chemistry into mass harm. Refrigeration systems were compromised. Safety equipment was inoperative or ineffective. Management failures and cost-cutting had hollowed out the buffer between routine operation and disaster. That history matters here because it reveals something deeper than a single accident. It shows that industrial safety is not merely a matter of having barriers in place once. It is a matter of sustaining them, checking them, testing them, and remaining answerable to the possibility that they may fail. In a humanless world, answerability disappears at the same moment the hazard remains. This recognition altered more than engineering manuals. It reshaped how many scientists and risk analysts thought about technology itself. The dream of perfect control gave way, slowly and imperfectly, to something more mature and less comforting. Complex systems do not stay safe simply because they were intelligently designed. They remain safe because intelligence continues to be applied after construction, during operation, during abnormal conditions, during repair, during the long, unglamorous life of maintenance. In the nuclear field, this became especially clear. A reactor is not a giant bomb waiting to explode in the crude sense imagined by popular fear. But neither is it a sealed monument that can be abandoned without consequence. It is a dynamic thermal and radiological system nested inside layers of hardware, procedure, and oversight. Its safety depends on choreography as much as on concrete. Once you begin to see that, the meaning of silence changes. An empty control room no longer signifies peace. It signifies a missing relationship. No one is reading the instruments. No one is comparing one indicator against another. No one is deciding which alarm matters most. No one is sending a crew into weather or darkness to verify a valve position. No one is checking whether a backup pump actually started when the panel says it did. The same stillness that looked, from the outside, like relief begins to feel different. It is the stillness of a watch post abandoned while the system under watch continues to evolve. And in some sense, that is the great correction this section has been moving toward. The first fantasy of a humanless Earth gave us plants, birdsong, weather, and the release of pressure. The first reality of unattended infrastructure gave us blackouts, dry taps, and failing pumps. Here, the story narrows and hardens. Certain inheritances do not forgive absence. They continue in heat, in decay, in stored chemical energy, in corrosion, in radioactivity, in inventories that needed only one thing from us to remain contained: ongoing care. The disappearance of people does not end those processes. It removes the one class of creature that had taken responsibility for managing them. Yet even concentrated danger has its own timescale. Fires burn out, reservoirs drain, batteries empty, cooling stops or holds. Depending on the design, toxic releases spread, settle, or dissipate. The acute phase passes unevenly, leaving behind another world still standing above all this damage: the broader, slower physical world of streets, tunnels, towers, roofs, concrete, steel, drainage, masonry, and glass. Once the alarms have gone unanswered and the most sensitive systems have crossed their thresholds, a different kind of transformation begins, quieter in its way, and patient enough to go on for decades. That slower transformation begins almost imperceptibly. After the alarms, the shutdowns, the unanswered warnings, the failures that belong to hours and days, there remains the immense physical body of the city itself. Towers still stand against the sky. Bridges still span their rivers. Windows continue reflecting weather. Streets hold their lines. If you could arrive months after the disappearance, you might be struck first by how much remains. Human construction, especially in the modern age, was never flimsy in the simple sense. It was heavy, layered, overbuilt in places, redundant in others, and often designed by people who thought in decades, sometimes in centuries. The drama here is not sudden ruin. It is the long withdrawal of resistance. For a very long time, architecture carried within it a dream of defiance. Cities were meant to outlast those who built them. Stone walls, vaulted halls, brick facades, iron frames, reinforced concrete, all expressed some version of the same ambition. The 19th and 20th centuries gave that ambition new materials and new confidence. Steel skeletons allowed buildings to rise higher than masonry alone could permit. Reinforced concrete seemed to promise a kind of rational permanence, a substance that could be poured into nearly any form and harden into modernity itself. Engineers wrote with enormous faith about durability, load-bearing capacity, fire resistance, and the disciplined marriage of compression and tension. The city became, in a sense, a declaration against weather and time. Yet the history of engineering is also the history of learning how patient the physical world can be. No structure exists in abstraction. Every wall is moving slightly under load. Every bridge expands and contracts with temperature. Water seeks joints, hairline cracks, seams, and porous edges. Frost opens what moisture has entered. Salts travel. Metals oxidize. Sunlight breaks down sealants and coatings. Roots exploit weakness without intention. Gravity never grows tired. The great insight that came to modern infrastructure science was not that buildings are weak, but that durability is always conditional. A city survives because matter is continuously coaxed back within acceptable limits. Concrete is a good place to feel that lesson, because it looks so final when first set. Modern life has trusted it with roads, towers, tunnels, stations, dams, parking decks, apartment blocks, seawalls, stairwells, retaining structures, and countless foundations whose existence most people rarely consider. For much of the 20th century, concrete was associated with permanence almost by instinct. But over time, engineers and materials scientists learned to read it more humbly. Concrete cracks. Sometimes the cracks are superficial, sometimes structural, sometimes expected, sometimes alarming only when they begin to guide water inward. Reinforcing steel, which gives concrete its tensile strength, can remain protected for years by the alkaline environment around it. Then moisture and chloride intrusion change that chemistry. Corrosion begins. Rust occupies more volume than the original steel. Internal pressure rises. Cracks widen. Pieces break away in rough flakes. What looked solid from the outside turns out to have been storing a quiet struggle within. This kind of decay rarely announces itself in theatrical gestures. It advances through cycles, Rain enters, then heat dries, then cold expands. Sealants fail at roof edges. Membranes age. Joint compounds split. Flashing lifts. A clogged drain keeps water where it should never linger. That small holding of water becomes the start of another sequence. Wood swells. Metal stains. Fasteners loosen. Plaster softens. Mold finds the dark. If a human caretaker remained, many of these would be ordinary maintenance issues. Expensive, perhaps, but still manageable. Without one, each small defect graduates into a pathway. The building does not decide to collapse. It simply stops being corrected. Glass, oddly enough, would preserve the illusion of urban life for a while. Skyscrapers and office towers might continue to gleam in the changing light long after their interiors had begun to shift into another condition. But glazing systems are not only transparent skins. They rely on gaskets, anchors, frames, pressure plates, sealants, drainage paths, and thermal tolerances. Strong winds would find panels whose fixings had weakened. Temperature differences would stress materials not designed to age unobserved. One failed pane would expose another layer, and then another. Eventually, storms would begin entering through broken elevations. Rain would reach carpets, drywall, electrical cavities, elevator shafts, insulation, and all the absorbent, fragile, or corrosion-prone things hidden behind the smooth public face. A tower would remain visible as a form before it remained habitable as a structure. Then there is the ground beneath the city, which is never as still as urban imagination prefers to believe. Streets sit on prepared layers that can settle, heave, wash out, or crack under changing water conditions. Foundations rest on soils and rock whose behavior depends on load. Drainage, clay content, freeze-thaw cycles, groundwater movement, and sometimes on much older histories of buried streams or filled marshland. Urban geology emerged as a discipline, partly because engineers kept being reminded that a city is never merely built on land. It is built with the land, against the land, and often in partial ignorance of what the land remembers. Once pumping systems fail and drainage patterns change, old vulnerabilities begin to return. Wet ground softens. Retaining walls receive pressures they were never meant to handle unattended. Sinkholes form where water undermines subsurface voids. Pavement buckles in places that once seemed dependable. Underground networks are especially revealing because they make the city's dependence on exclusion so literal. Subways, service tunnels, road underpasses, utility conduits, basements, and buried chambers remain usable only by keeping certain elements out. Water, roots, corrosion, gas buildup, sediment, uncontrolled heat. The public usually experiences these spaces as finished interiors, lit and passable. But their ordinary condition is achieved against a constant tendency towards seepage and accumulation. Hydrogeologists and civil engineers have long understood that below-grade infrastructure is less like a sealed box than like a contested boundary. Pumps remove infiltrating water. Linings are repaired. Cracks are injected. Drainage channels are cleaned. Ventilation removes moisture and heat. In the absence of all that effort, low points begin to fill. Stagnant water spreads slowly along floors and track beds. Electrical systems fail in damp enclosures. Iron components corrode more aggressively. Concrete spalls. Tile detaches. The underground city becomes a collection of artificial caverns, gradually surrendered back to mineral logic. There is an odd intimacy to this stage of urban decline because so much of it begins indoors. Apartments hold their furnishings in place long after climate control has stopped. Curtains fade, upholstery absorbs damp, books warp on shelves, ceiling stains bloom outward in brown maps that no one repaints. Refrigerators warm and sour, freezers thaw and then quiet forever. In colder regions, winter enters with new authority. Pipes freeze, expand, and rupture. Water spreads through walls and ceilings, then hardens and opens further gaps. In hotter climates, interiors become chambers of heat cycling, humidity, mildew, insect colonization, and gradual material fatigue. Domestic space was always a negotiation with environment. Human disappearance simply ends the negotiation. Bridges would tell a similar story at a grander scale. They can appear almost ageless when viewed from afar, each one an emblem of confidence held over water, roadway, or valley. But bridge engineering has always lived with inspection for a reason. Steel members corrode where coatings fail. Bearings seize or deteriorate. Expansion joints admit water and salts. Concrete decks crack under traffic and weather. Cables on suspension and cable-stayed structures must remain protected against moisture, intrusion, because hidden corrosion inside a wire bundle can advance long before an outer form changes enough to worry a casual eye. A bridge without traffic might actually be relieved of one kind of stress. Yet without maintenance, it would continue aging beneath sun, rain, mist, and seasonal movement. One day the failure would look abrupt. In reality, it would have been accumulating quietly for years. Rivers, too, would begin revising the lines we forced on them. Embankments, flood walls, culverts, storm drains, detention systems, and channelized reaches all reflect a long urban determination to discipline water into predictable paths. That determination had reasons behind it. Growing cities feared cholera, feared inundation, feared the disruption of transport and trade. Engineers straightened channels, built levees, lined banks, buried streams, and taught municipal governments to think of water as both a service and a threat. Yet rivers remain patient revisionists. Silt gathers where dredging stops. Vegetation takes root in neglected channels. Gates fail in one position or another. Culverts clog with debris. Minor flood events begin doing work once spread across many agencies and maintenance crews. Over enough years, a city's hydrology changes from something managed to something rediscovered. Dams and reservoirs deepen the feeling that human works do not all fail at the same tempo. A great dam may stand for decades after people are gone, not because it is beyond decay, but because of its sheer scale and the conservative assumptions built into its design. But these structures depend on more than mass. Spillways must remain operable. Seepage must be monitored. Sediment accumulates in reservoirs. Vegetation grows in places where it should be removed. Concrete ages. Metal gates corrode. Small defects that would once have been noticed during inspection rounds are left to enlarge under seasonal stress. The history of dam engineering has always included humility before slow processes. Catastrophic failures do happen, but often the more common story is prolonged aging under imperfect observation. In a humanless world, imperfect observation becomes none at all. Mining landscapes would go on changing in their own stern manner, even after extraction ends. Cut rock, spoil heaps, tunnels, shafts, and tailings remain in conversation with air and water. Geochemists learned this with great clarity in places where sulfide minerals, once exposed, reacted to produce acid mine drainage. Streams turned orange with precipitated iron compounds. Aquatic life declined. Metals moved through watersheds long after the original industry that caused them had faded from memory. It is a sobering pattern because it belongs to the same family as the nuclear lesson. Though in a slower register, some inheritances continue chemically after the people who made them are gone. And unlike the spectacle of a single collapse, this kind of persistence can stain a landscape for generations. If one were to move through the post-human city year by year, the most striking feature might be unevenness. Some neighborhoods would appear almost frozen for a long interval, especially in dry climates where rot advances slowly and storms are infrequent. Elsewhere, moisture, vegetation, salinity, flood risk, freeze-thaw cycles, or poor original construction would accelerate change. Coastal districts would suffer from salt and storm exposure. Regions with harsh winters would see repeated cracking and rupture. Areas built on unstable fill or soft soils would settle into distortion sooner. Wooden towns might soften and lean. Brick structures would lose mortar and begin shedding pieces. Glass-heavy commercial zones would become perforated. Concrete parking decks would flake from within. There would be no single ruin schedule for civilization. There would be thousands of local biographies of decay. That insight mirrors a broader evolution in the way engineers themselves came to think. The early modern city often advertised permanence. Later infrastructure science became more comfortable with service life cycle cost, fatigue, deterioration modeling, maintenance regimes, and the stubborn reality that every system ages differently under different conditions. This shift was not a confession of failure. It was a sign of maturity. Bridges, tunnels, water mains, towers, pavements, and retaining systems did not need to be eternal to be worthwhile. They needed to be understood honestly, including their drift toward damage. In a strange way, the post-human thought experiment takes that mature engineering insight and removes the only thing that made it governable. Service life remains, service does not. The city would also become quieter in the acoustical sense, though not silent. Window glass rattles differently when there is no traffic under it. Wind moves through broken interiors with changing tones. Rain on metal roofing becomes more audible when heating systems are gone. Somewhere, an unsecured door taps at regular intervals. Water falling into a flooded concourse makes a persistent echo. Pieces drop occasionally from facades. Birds occupy cavities once filled by vents and ducts. Bats find roosts in eaves and under bridges. Insects lay claim to insulation and timber. The sounds of urban decay are subtle, repetitive, almost administrative. They belong to a world that is not exploding, but being revised. And yet, in that revision, something visually seductive begins to appear. Planters overflow first, then medians, cracks, gutters, vacant lots, railway margins, rooftops where enough dust has gathered into a thin, accidental soil. Mosses arrive where damp persists. Small trees root against walls. Ivy or other climbers find scaffolds in facades and fences. The built environment, once so cleanly separated from what it excluded, starts hosting an increasing number of opportunists. For a while, the scene seems to confirm the old fantasy. After all, gray yields to green. Hard lines soften. Weather stains become backgrounds for growth. If the earlier stages of disappearance were dominated by invisible dependencies, this later stage begins to offer visible symbols. But appearances, as we have been learning all along, do not finish the story. A building overgrown with vegetation may be structurally weakening, or merely cosmetically changed, or creating its own microclimate of moisture retention that speeds future damage. A flooded tunnel may host life at its edges while remaining a record of engineering defeat. A cracked roadway lined with saplings can look peaceful and still be resting above damaged sewers, unstable soils, and years of accumulated chemical residue. The city is becoming other than it was. Yes, but other is not yet the same as recovered. To understand what sort of return is actually taking place, one has to leave the language of architecture alone for a while and enter another discipline entirely, one shaped by observers who spent decades asking what happens after disturbance, and whether the living world ever comes back by following a single script. To understand what kind of return is actually taking place, the gaze has to change. A cracked boulevard with saplings at its edges can stir the imagination in an instant. But imagination alone cannot tell us whether we are looking at recovery, replacement, improvisation, or merely the first visible stage of another long and uneven process. The overgrown building, the flooded underpass, the quiet lot filling with grasses, all seem to say that life comes back when pressure lifts. Yet for more than a century, ecologists have been asking a harder question than that. They have been asking what comes back means, whether living communities follow a script after disturbance, and whether a landscape ever returns in the simple sense people usually have in mind. That question began to take scientific form in the late 19th century, when naturalists and botanists were learning to look at vegetation as something historical rather than merely decorative. Plants were no longer just being named and classified. They were being watched in relation to one another, to soils, to climate, to fire, to exposure, to time. A marsh, a dune field, a forest edge, a cut-over slope, an abandoned field. Each began to look less like a static picture and more like a moment in an unfolding sequence. The living world did not always sit still long enough to match the categories people had built for it. Under the surface of botany, a new kind of attention was forming. One of the places where that attention sharpened was in the Indiana Dunes, along the southern shore of Lake Michigan. There, around the turn of the 20th century, the botanist Henry Chandler Cowles studied plant communities spread across dunes of different ages and positions. The landscape offered a rare gift. It arranged, side by side, what looked like stages in ecological development, from bare sand with sparse colonizing species to more established vegetation inland. Cowles treated space as a kind of substitute for time. By reading the dunes comparatively, he could imagine how one plant community might give way to another. His work did not solve the mystery of recovery, but it helped turn succession into a serious scientific problem. A landscape could now be read as an argument about change. At nearly the same time, a far more dramatic scene was forcing similar questions into global view. In 1883, Krakatoa erupted catastrophically in what is now Indonesia. Much of the island was devastated. Ash, pumice, and heat transformed the terrain so completely that later observers would treat it almost as a natural reset button. Here, in the aftermath of destruction on a scale no ecologist could produce experimentally, was a chance to watch life arrive where so much had been stripped away. In the decades that followed, botanists, zoologists, and geographers paid close attention to recolonization. Seeds and spores came by wind and sea. Birds carried propagules. Coastal pioneers established themselves. Soil slowly accumulated organic matter, and the first rough vegetation began altering the conditions for what followed. Krakatoa became one of the great ecological theaters of recovery, not because it offered a neat moral, but because it let scientists watch assembly where the sequence seemed unusually exposed. From cases like these, a larger ambition emerged. Some ecologists began to wonder whether the living world, despite all its local variation, might obey recognizable laws of development. Frederick Clements became the most famous advocate of that ambition. Born in 1874, trained as a botanist, energetic, system-building, and unusually drawn to large conceptual order, Clements approached vegetation with the mind of someone who wanted patterns broad enough to organize a field. In 1916, in his influential work Plant Succession, he described succession as a directional process through which plant communities moved toward a climax state, determined largely by climate. Disturbance might knock a landscape back. Fire, flood, grazing, cultivation, storm damage, volcanic eruption, all could interrupt. Yet if conditions allowed, the system would tend to develop again toward a mature endpoint. There was something deeply satisfying in that vision. It gave ecology an architecture of time. Bare ground led to pioneers. Pioneers altered the site. New species arrived. Competition changed. Biomass accumulated. Shade deepened. Soils thickened. A more stable and integrated community formed. Clements even used the language of development in ways that made the community sound almost organism-like, as though vegetation itself passed through stages of youth and maturity. This gave ecology a grandness that appealed to many early readers. Recovery no longer looked like a scatter of isolated events. It looked like growth with direction. Part of Clements's appeal lay in temperament as much as theory. Historians of ecology often note that he favored synthesis, broad structure, and system-level order. He was drawn to the idea that science should discover general processes beneath local confusion. His fieldwork was real and demanding, but the deeper attraction seemed to be toward coherence. A world undergoing change did not have to remain messy forever. If observed correctly, it could reveal the logic of its own becoming. For a generation of ecologists trying to establish their field, that promise carried power. Succession offered a way to think of ecology as a serious science of process, not simply a descriptive inventory of who grew where. And yet even at the height of that confidence, nature had a way of producing counterexamples. Some disturbed places did not move toward the expected endpoint, or did so only partially, or stalled in ways that complicated any simple model. Local histories mattered. So did accidents of dispersal. So did soils, microclimates, grazing pressures, fire regimes, and the timing of arrival. Species did not always behave as loyal participants in a predetermined sequence. Some entered, lingered, and vanished. Others failed to appear despite seemingly favorable conditions. The more carefully ecologists watched actual places over time, the more they encountered a tension between elegant theory and uneven reality. That tension found its sharpest early expression in the work of Henry Allen Gleason. If Clements had a synthesizer's instinct, Gleason seemed more at ease with contingency. He was less persuaded by the idea that plant communities functioned as tightly integrated superorganisms moving toward a collective destiny. In 1926, he articulated what later became known as the individualistic concept of plant association. According to this view, a vegetation assemblage is not necessarily a coherent entity with a shared developmental plan. It may instead reflect the overlapping responses of individual species, each with its own tolerances, dispersal opportunities, and history. A forest, meadow, or marsh might look like a unified whole, but that wholeness could be partly an illusion created by co-occurrence. This was not a mere technical disagreement buried in journals. It touched the emotional heart of how people imagined order in nature. Clements gave ecologists a world that healed through lawful development. Gleason offered a world that assembled itself more loosely, more opportunistically, more historically, in one picture. Disturbance was a setback along a recognizable path. In the other, disturbance opened a field of possibilities whose outcome depended on who arrived, who survived, and what conditions prevailed at particular moments. These views were not always presented as total opposites, and later ecology would find ways to absorb parts of both. Still, the contrast mattered. It introduced a durable uncertainty into the very word recovery. Once that uncertainty entered the field, ecological succession could no longer be treated as a simple march toward harmony. It became a question of scale, mechanism, and evidence. Are there stable endpoints in some climates and not others? How strongly do early colonizers shape later arrivals? Do communities converge, diverge, or oscillate? How much can one generalize from grassland to forest, from island to mainland, from volcanic ash to abandoned farmland? These were not merely abstract puzzles. They changed how people saw every disturbed landscape around them. A field left uncultivated was no longer just growing back. It was participating in a process whose meaning depended on theory. As ecology matured through the 20th century, the field became more cautious about grand inevitabilities. Disturbance gained greater importance. Fire ecology expanded. Patch dynamics, non-equilibrium thinking, island biogeography, and later forms of landscape ecology complicated older visions of smooth progression. Arthur Tansley's concept of the ecosystem redirected attention toward flows of energy and matter across living and non-living components. Eugene Odum and others advanced systems thinking in new ways. Meanwhile, empirical fieldwork kept reminding researchers that landscapes have memories. A site does not restart from nowhere. Nutrients, seed banks, compaction, hydrology, invasive species, contamination, grazing history, and climate regime all shape what can happen next. This did not make succession obsolete. It made it richer and more difficult. Ecologists came to distinguish between primary succession, where life begins to establish on newly exposed or newly created surfaces with little or no developed soil, and secondary succession, where disturbance has removed much of the existing community but left behind a soil, organic matter, propagules, and other legacies. That distinction is crucial for the human disappearance thought experiment. A modern city abandoned by people is not Krakatoa after ash sterilization, nor is it an untouched plain awaiting first colonizers. It is a profoundly modified environment full of surfaces, chemicals, fragments, seed sources, drains, shade patterns, heat-retaining materials, buried pipes, feral animals, ornamental plants, compacted soils, and forgotten disturbances. The living world that enters such a place is not beginning from zero. That is one reason later case studies became so valuable. Ecologists needed more than theory. They needed long observations in places where disturbance had occurred in different ways, under different climates, at different scales. Volcanic islands remained especially useful because they allowed scientists to watch assembly under stripped-down conditions. When Surtsey emerged off the coast of Iceland in 1963, it offered a rare modern counterpart to earlier island recolonization studies, but with better tools, better documentation, and a far stronger awareness of ecological process. Access was tightly controlled to limit contamination by casual visitors. Researchers could monitor how wind, birds, microbes, and later plants gradually transformed a raw volcanic surface. The first arrivals were sparse. Then seabirds began nesting, and their guano enriched the developing soils. Suddenly, some parts of the island changed faster than others. A place that had seemed geologically uniform began to reveal biological patchiness. Surtsey was especially instructive because it showed how quickly sequence becomes entangled with history. Colonization was not simply a ladder climbed in orderly steps. It was helped and redirected by birds, weather, nutrient inputs, exposure, and accident. Some species established early and failed later. Others arrived only when prior changes had made the ground more hospitable. The island was small, young, and unusual, but the lesson traveled widely. Even in one of the clearest observational laboratories on Earth, recovery was neither wholly random nor fully predetermined. It had structure, but structure expressed through contingency. This is where the older debate between Clements and Gleason remains quietly alive. Modern ecologists do not usually stage the disagreement in its original terms, yet the underlying tension still shapes how disturbed landscapes are interpreted. There are regularities in succession. Disturbance types matter. Soil development matters. Climate matters. Competitive interactions matter. Facilitation matters. Yet there is also history, accident, dispersal limitation, and a deep resistance in the living world to being reduced to one storyline. The desire for a single timetable of return, especially in public imagination, keeps meeting a scientific tradition that has spent a century discovering how context-dependent return can be. For the thought experiment of human disappearance, that matters enormously. When people say the Earth would heal, they often smuggle in a version of Clements without knowing it. They imagine a damaged system naturally finding its way back toward a stable, preferable state once the source of disturbance is removed. Sometimes that may describe part of what happens. Forest cover may increase, biomass may accumulate, certain species may rebound, streams may clarify where pollution falls away. But the modern ecological record urges caution. Earlier land use can redirect future trajectories for decades or centuries. Novel species assemblages can form. Invasive plants can dominate disturbed ground. Fire patterns can shift. Herbivore populations can surge. Some habitats rich in species may decline without human mowing or grazing. The field does not support the old fantasy of a universal script. There is another, subtler change that ecology brought to human thought. It altered the moral image of nature itself. The older romantic view of untouched landscapes often imagined balance as something that existed only where people had not interfered. Succession science, disturbance ecology, and historical ecology gradually weakened that simplicity. Many beloved landscapes were not timeless Edens. They were products of fire, flood, storms, animal movement, indigenous land use, long cultivation, abandonment, cutting, recovery, and secondary growth. In other words, Change was not the exception. It was the medium. A world without humans would not become static nature restored. It would continue changing through ecological processes that had never stopped changing anyway. And still, despite all this complication, the allure of return remains understandable. To see life re-enter a damaged place is genuinely moving. Grass through pavement is not a false image, nor is a young forest rising in old clearings, or birds nesting in abandoned structures, or insects and fungi taking hold where human routines once swept everything clean. The mistake lies in allowing those signs to stand in for the whole. Ecologists learned, often against the grain of public desire, that visible regrowth is only one layer of the story. To know what sort of return is happening, one has to ask who is absent, who is arriving, what the soil remembers, what the hydrology permits, what toxins remain, what species were lost before the regrowth began, and what processes now govern the site. That is why this section of the story belongs as much to patience as to theory. Succession was not discovered in a single decisive experiment. It was assembled through generations of watching dunes, volcanic islands, old fields, logged stands, recovering marshes, burned forests, and colonizing shorelines. Watching enough to notice that the phrase coming back compresses too much into too little. Watching enough to realize that recovery can be directional without being inevitable. Orderly in one place and unruly in another. Assisted by prior life, obstructed by prior damage, and permanently altered by what came before. So when we return in imagination to the empty city with its weeds at the curb and young trees gathering in vacant lots, we do so with a different kind of eye. The green advance no longer reads as an automatic verdict. It reads as a question. Which species? Under what conditions? Toward what sort of community? With what hidden legacies from the human period still shaping the outcome? The science does not erase wonder. It refines it. And once that refinement takes hold, another need follows naturally. Theory can carry us only so far. Volcanoes and dunes taught ecologists how to think. Debates gave them language precise enough to resist sentimentality. But if we want to know what a world partly released from human presence actually looks like, and how visible return can coexist with stranger forms of damage, we have to leave the conceptual ground of succession for a moment and step into places where people, for one reason or another, already have. So we step out of theory and into places where absence is no longer hypothetical. The thought experiment has been asking what might happen if people vanished everywhere at once. But the world already contains landscapes where human routines thinned, stopped, or were forced back behind a line. These places are never perfect models. Each has its own history, its own damage, its own climate, its own politics. Even so, they matter because they interrupt abstraction. They allow ecologists, radiation biologists, conservationists, and historians to look at a changed landscape and ask a difficult question with real soil under their feet. When people leave, what actually follows? Chernobyl is the most famous of these places, and perhaps the most misleading if one sees it only through photographs. After the reactor explosion in April 1986, vast areas around the plant were evacuated. Towns emptied. Farms were abandoned. Roads grew quiet. Apartment blocks, schools, Ferris wheels, clinics, and courtyards remained standing in a strange suspension that seemed to invite every old fantasy at once. Trees rose through neglected spaces. Moss spread where feet once passed daily. Wolves, boar, elk, foxes, birds, and many other animals moved through territory where the ordinary human pressure of farming, traffic, hunting, and settlement had abruptly diminished. To a casual eye, it could look like a brutal confirmation of the oldest story in this documentary. Human beings withdraw, and life returns. Scientists were drawn there for exactly that reason, but also because the site violated ordinary categories. Chernobyl was both contamination zone and large involuntary reserve. It was a place where the damaging effects of radiation and the ecological effects of human absence were tangled together so tightly that no one could separate them without argument. Some researchers, especially those looking at large mammals over broad areas, found striking signs of recovery in abundance and distribution. Camera traps, track surveys, and field observations suggested that populations of some big animals were doing surprisingly well in a landscape with little direct human disturbance. Those findings carried force because they challenged a simple assumption. Radiation might be dangerous, but ordinary human land use, roads, machines, noise, and hunting had also been dangerous in their own ways. Yet another body of work told a darker story. Field biologists such as Anders Müller and Timothy Mousseau, working especially on birds, insects, and smaller organisms, reported evidence of elevated abnormalities, reduced abundance in some taxae, cataracts, reproductive problems, and other forms of biological stress in more contaminated areas. Radiobiologists and geneticists asked different questions than the researchers counting large mammals from tracks or photographs. They were less interested in whether animals occupied the zone in visible numbers, and more interested in what radiation might be doing inside bodies, across generations, or in delicate parts of an ecosystem not captured by dramatic images of wolves in snow. That difference in scale mattered. A place can hold many large animals and still be a place of profound invisible injury. What makes Chernobyl scientifically valuable is precisely that no single image settles the issue. A herd in a clearing proves one thing. A damaged genome may prove another. A bird song heard in spring says something real about recolonization. A mutation rate says something equally real about exposure. The public often wanted a verdict, as though the zone should teach one clean lesson about humanity and nature. The actual research resisted that hunger. Some investigators emphasized that, for many species, the removal of people seemed to outweigh the harm of contamination at the level of landscape occupancy. Others argued that such conclusions could obscure chronic biological costs, especially in smaller organisms or in metrics that abundance alone could not reveal. In that disagreement, one can hear a deeper scientific caution. Recovery and damage are not opposites that politely take turns. They can coexist in the same field, the same forest, the same animal community. There is also a psychological reason Chernobyl holds the imagination so firmly. It gives visible form to something modern people already suspect, which is that many non-human lives are held back less by our brilliance than by our constant presence. Take the roads away, remove the daily disturbance, silence the machines, empty the houses. What follows may be a rush of return, but Chernobyl also refuses innocence. The return is happening through fallout, exclusion, mutation, and human catastrophe. In other words, it does not offer the clean moral release the fantasy wants. It offers an ecological truth wrapped around a nuclear wound. The Korean demilitarized zone presents a very different kind of absence. Here, the retreat of human settlement and ordinary development was not caused by technological disaster, but by war, division, and decades of armed tension. The DMZ is one of the most militarized borders on Earth, and yet within and around that belt of restricted access, wetlands, grasslands, forests, and riverine habitats have persisted with far less urbanization and industrial disturbance than the surrounding regions. Over time, conservationists began to notice that this politically frozen line had become, almost accidentally, a refuge for wildlife. Migratory birds used its wetlands. Rare plants endured. Mammals moved through a strip of land that remained dangerous to people and comparatively permissive to other forms of life. The irony here is powerful. A landscape shaped by conflict becomes a sanctuary through exclusion. But once again, the lesson is not as simple as leave and life returns. The DMZ is not an untouched Eden. It is a boundary produced by militarization, mines, fences, patrols, and the long afterlife of war. Its habitats were not preserved by some neutral act of stepping aside. They were preserved through a historical condition that prevented ordinary development for reasons having nothing to do with ecological wisdom. Conservation biologists recognize the opportunity while also recognizing the strangeness of it. This was refuge born of danger. Biodiversity protected by a political wound. Restricted military lands elsewhere complicate the picture further. Across Europe and in other parts of the world, military training grounds, artillery ranges, and buffer zones have sometimes supported species-rich mosaics of open habitat precisely because they escaped urban sprawl, intensive agriculture, and commercial development. Heathlands, grasslands, and sandy habitats can survive in such places for long periods, yet their persistence is sometimes tied to disturbance itself, even if that disturbance is not the kind conservationists would ever choose as a first principle. Vehicle movement, periodic burning, clearing, or other repeated disruption may prevent woody encroachment and maintain open conditions that certain plants, insects, and birds require. If human pressure disappears entirely from those settings, some valued species may decline as shrubs and forests take over. That is a difficult truth, and an important one. It means that absence is not automatically the same as ecological improvement. The answer depends on what sort of life had been there, what processes maintained it, and what exactly human activity had been doing in that place. A training ground can be terrible as history and complicated as ecology. A quiet border strip can be biologically rich without being morally simple. These are not contradictions to be solved away. They are clues to how deeply mixed human and non-human histories have become. Depopulated rural landscapes tell a slower version of the same story. Across parts of Europe, Asia, and elsewhere, villages have thinned, farms have been abandoned, and terraced land or pasture once held open by labor has begun passing into scrub and young forest. From one angle, this can look like a clear instance of recovery. Trees spread, carbon accumulates, soil may stabilize. Larger mammals sometimes return as human density falls. Yet ecologists studying abandonment have repeatedly found that these transitions can also reduce species tied to traditional low-intensity land use. Flower-rich meadows decline when mowing ceases. Open habitat birds lose ground as shrubs advance. Grassland insects that depended on a mosaic of grazing and cutting can disappear from landscapes that, to an untrained eye, look greener and therefore healthier. This difference between visible greening and ecological value is one of the most revealing lessons these places offer. The public imagination often assumes that more vegetation equals more restoration. Scientists learn to ask a more precise set of questions. More vegetation for which species? More cover under what fire regime? More biomass at the expense of what habitat diversity? A hillside can look lush and still represent the loss of a carefully maintained cultural ecosystem that once held extraordinary local richness. In some abandoned agricultural regions, forest regrowth is a gain in one register and a loss in another. That is exactly the kind of result a simple myth cannot handle. There are urban examples as well, especially in former industrial districts where economic collapse, contamination, or long-term disinvestment created spaces outside ordinary maintenance. Ecologists working in such places sometimes found unexpectedly diverse plant communities establishing on rubble, rail margins, vacant lots, slag heaps, and brownfields. These were not pristine assemblages. They often mixed native and non-native species, drought-tolerant pioneers, ornamentals escaped from cultivation, and opportunists adapted to heat, compaction, and chemical stress. Some researchers came to see these landscapes as laboratories of novel ecology. They were messy, improvised, and historically specific, yet they made one thing unmistakable. Living communities do not wait for purity. They establish wherever conditions permit, even on ground profoundly altered by industry. That insight brought ecology into conversation with a newer unease. If abandoned industrial sites can host surprising life, what exactly are we seeing there? Are these damaged lands recovering? Are they becoming something unprecedented? Should the goal be restoration to an earlier state, acceptance of a novel assemblage, or some hybrid of both? Different traditions within conservation answered differently. Some favored historical baselines. Others became more interested in function, resilience, and the practical realities of a changed planet. The places humans had left behind were no longer just examples. They were arguments. Chernobyl returned at the center of many of those arguments because it was so visually persuasive and scientifically unstable. Documentary crews loved it because it offered a ready-made contrast between abandoned human design and non-human persistence. Journalists loved it because wolves and apartment blocks can share a frame. Researchers, however, had to work inside the frame's seduction. A large mammal photographed in a ruined street is compelling, but it tells us little about radionuclide exposure in an insect, or developmental stress in a bird, or reproductive outcomes across generations. Some scientists criticized what they saw as selective public storytelling, a preference for charismatic animals and eerie landscapes over less visible biological realities. Others warned against allowing radiation damage, however real, to obscure the ecological fact that intense human occupation had once suppressed many species more effectively than absence allowed. No one could claim a neutral vantage point for long. To count animals is to choose one form of evidence. To measure mutation, stress hormones, reproductive performance, microbiome shifts, or cellular damage is to choose another. Good science needs both. The tension between them says less about bad faith than about the complexity of the place itself. In that sense, Chernobyl became a lesson in methodology as much as in ecology. What you find depends partly on what you ask, what scale you observe, what organisms you privilege, and what outcome you mean by the word better. That same methodological humility applies to the DMZ and other restricted landscapes. A borderland may preserve habitat while fragmenting migration in other ways. A military exclusion zone may shelter birds because ordinary development is absent, even while mines and fences remain part of the terrain. A vacant city district may show spontaneous plant diversity while still containing heavy metals, unstable structures, or hydrological damage. The places humans left behind are scientifically precious because they expose the gap between moral intuition and ecological description. They remind us that landscapes do not become legible simply because they become quiet. There is another layer here, one that concerns the psychology of scientists themselves. Many researchers who entered these spaces were keenly aware of public longing. The world wanted proof that nature could outlast us, that wounded ground was not doomed forever, that the future might contain return. Scientists are not immune to such hopes, but their discipline asks them to hold hope next to evidence, and evidence next to doubt. A camera trap image can be beautiful and insufficient. A field count can be carefully done and still partial. A contaminated forest can hold both abundance and injury, refuge and risk. The intellectual discipline required here is almost moral in its own way. One must resist the urge to turn a complicated place into a parable too quickly. That resistance changed environmental thought. It made it harder to speak of absence in simplistic terms. The withdrawal of people can release some ecological processes. Yes, it can also preserve damage, expose new vulnerabilities, or alter habitat in ways that favor one set of organisms while disadvantaging another. There is no single category called nature waiting uniformly behind the human world. There are many populations, many habitats, many histories, many dependencies, many forms of resilience and harm. Left behind places reveal this not through abstract theory, but through their own uneven lives. If one stands back from these examples, a pattern begins to emerge, though it is subtler than the old fantasy promised. Ordinary human presence has enormous ecological weight. Its removal can matter more, in some cases, than people once imagined. Roads, hunting, traffic, clearing, farming intensity, settlement, and industrial activity shape who lives where and in what numbers. Pull those away, and many species respond quickly. That is real. Yet the response unfolds through whatever world humans had already made before leaving. Contamination remains contamination. Drained wetlands remain drained unless hydrology changes. Altered fire regimes remain altered. Introduced species do not politely depart. Even peace itself, in some of these landscapes, has been produced by histories of violence. And so these places begin to teach us something larger than their own boundaries. They suggest that the question is no longer merely what survives when people disappear from a local scene. It is what kind of scene had already been created before the disappearance occurred. A field, a borderland, an industrial district, an exclusion zone, a depopulated valley. Each carries forward older decisions in soil chemistry, species composition, water pathways, and disturbance patterns. Human absence enters that inheritance. It does not wipe it clean. That is where this journey now needs to widen again. The abandoned places of the world have given us something precious. They have shown that visible return can be real and still partial. They have shown that fewer humans can mean more room for some forms of life, without dissolving toxins, erasing mutation, or restoring some lost original balance. They have shown that a greener scene may still be an altered one. From here, the thought experiment has to move beyond exclusion zones and borderlands and empty districts into a broader realization that even the most visibly recovered future would still be growing out of landscapes, food webs, and evolutionary pressures that human history had already reshaped long before anyone left. That broader realization begins with a quiet but difficult shift in perspective. The abandoned places we have just visited tempt the eye into thinking locally. A city empties. A borderland quiets. An evacuation zone fills with birdsong. And the question seems to answer itself at the scale of a single frame. Yet a future without humans would not grow out of empty places alone. It would grow out of a planet already shaped for thousands of years by cultivation, burning, hunting, transport, drainage, clearing, damming, grazing, breeding, and the long movement of organisms in the wake of human settlement. By the time the streets turned green, the deeper work would already have been done. The landscapes receiving that new growth would not be ancient ground, waiting to resume an interrupted story. They would be historical ground, carrying old instructions inside them. For a long time, many people in Europe and North America found it easy to imagine wilderness as the opposite of humanity, a condition of absence that existed where people had not yet arrived, or had left no meaningful mark. Some early conservation traditions were shaped by that feeling. Certain forests, mountains, and plains appeared to offer access to a more original Earth, a world outside history. The appeal was understandable. It gave the non-human world a kind of dignity, and gave modern societies a reason to preserve what they feared losing. But as archaeology, paleoecology, and historical geography matured, that image began to crack. The more researchers learned to read sediments, pollen grains, charcoal layers, ancient field systems, plant distributions, and altered soils, the harder it became to sustain a simple distinction between natural landscapes and human ones. One of the most revealing tools in that change of understanding was astonishingly small. Pollen preserved in lake beds and peat deposits can endure for centuries or millennia. And when paleoecologists learned how to recover and interpret those grains at scale, landscapes began to acquire memory. Forest composition could be traced through time. Episodes of clearance, regrowth, cultivation, and burning left signatures. Charcoal fragments spoke of fire histories. Tree rings recorded climatic stress and disturbance. Phytoliths, seeds, animal bones, and buried soils filled in further detail. A valley that had once looked timeless might turn out to have been repeatedly opened by fire, grazed, farmed, abandoned, and recolonized. A woodland could be older than living memory and still not be original in the way older romantic thought had assumed. In the Americas, Australia, Africa, and elsewhere, this growing body of evidence slowly forced a reconsideration of indigenous land use that had often been minimized or misunderstood by colonial observers. Fire was central to that reconsideration. For generations, some landscapes had been described as though they maintained themselves in a purely spontaneous balance, when in fact, careful, repeated burning by indigenous communities had shaped grasslands, open woodlands, travel corridors, hunting grounds, and plant distributions over long periods. Later, ecologists came to appreciate that controlled fire was not a crude interruption of nature. In many places, it was part of how a habitat was maintained. Remove the people who were setting and timing those fires, and the landscape would not necessarily revert to some more authentic condition. It might grow denser. Fuel might accumulate differently, and the entire rhythm of ecological disturbance could change. That insight can feel almost counterintuitive at first. especially to an imagination trained by the old fantasy of human absence as release. We assume that fewer people means fewer disturbances, but ecologists learned, often with difficulty, that the right question is not whether disturbance exists. It is what kind, how often, at what scale, and in whose absence or presence. A grassland rich in species may depend on periodic fire or grazing. A meadow full of flowers may be a cultural landscape maintained by mowing, herding, or low-intensity farming. Remove those practices and shrubs advance. Tree cover thickens, light changes, and species that once seemed native to the open ground may disappear. More vegetation, in such a case, is not a return to an older equilibrium. It is a transformation into something else. Europe offers many examples of this tension because so much of what looks pastoral and long settled is also biologically intricate. High meadows, wooded pastures, heathlands, and hedged agricultural mosaics can support extraordinary richness precisely because they were shaped by long human use that was neither industrial nor entirely absent. When such places are abandoned, succession often begins moving toward scrub and forest, which can increase biomass and carbon storage while reducing the specialized plants, insects, and birds adapted to open conditions. A hillside may look greener after abandonment than it did under grazing. Yet, from the standpoint of local biodiversity, it may also be poorer. This is one of the reasons conservationists and historical ecologists became wary of easy language about healing. The visible signs of exuberant growth can conceal a quieter narrowing in the kinds of life a place supports. Something similar is true in regions where drainage, irrigation, terrace building, and soil modification have shaped human landscapes for centuries. Fields do not forget instantly. Even after cultivation stops, they retain altered nutrient levels, compaction, changed hydrology, imported species, stone boundaries, seed banks, ditch systems, and patterns of shade and exposure established by prior land use. Orchards may continue fruiting for years. Hedgerows may persist as corridors. Drainage channels can keep wetlands drier than they once were. Or their gradual failure can create new marshy conditions in places that had long ceased to behave as wetlands. The next ecological chapter begins inside these legacies. It does not write on blank paper. Archaeology has deepened that lesson further by showing that some landscapes once imagined as wild had already been profoundly reworked long before industrial modernity. In the Amazon, the discovery of dark anthropogenic soils, earthworks, managed forest mosaics, and evidence of dense pre-Columbian settlement disrupted older visions of the region as an untouched green immensity. Certain forest compositions appear to have been shaped partly by human preference and management, with useful species encouraged over long stretches of time. In Mesoamerica, ancient cities did not simply sit within a surrounding nature that remained unchanged. Their reservoirs, terracing, causeways, cleared zones, household gardens, and agricultural hinterlands restructured local ecologies in ways that lasted beyond political collapse. Even when monumental architecture fell silent, the land did not revert to a pure before. It carried forward altered soils, altered drainage, altered plant communities. Historians of environment eventually had to say this more plainly. There may be no single before us to which a post-human Earth could return. There are many pasts layered beneath the present, and humans have been implicated in a surprising number of them. William Denovan's phrase, the pristine myth, captured part of this challenge by arguing against the idea that the Americas, before European colonization, were sparsely inhabited landscapes waiting in natural innocence. The phrase was provocative, and not every detail of the broader debate has been settled neatly. But the direction of the intellectual change matters. The old contrast between humanity and untouched nature had grown too blunt to describe the evidence. People had been shaping environments for millennia, though not always in the same ways, at the same intensities, or with the same consequences. Once that deeper history comes into view, the post-human thought experiment begins to feel stranger. The question is no longer what happens when pressure lifts from a world that was otherwise natural. The question becomes what kinds of ecological futures emerge from landscapes already modified by long sequences of human action. The answer will differ from one region to another. Forests may reclaim abandoned cropland. Wetlands may reappear where pumping ends. Some river channels may loosen from engineered confinement. Yet all of this unfolds through inheritances that remain stubbornly historical. A greener world can still be a profoundly anthropogenic one. The same is true of the creatures living alongside us now. Popular imagination often assumes that the species most closely associated with human life would be the immediate victors of our disappearance. Rats in subway tunnels, pigeons on ledges, cockroaches in kitchens, gulls at landfills, foxes at the urban fringe, perhaps even feral cats and dogs sweeping outward into the silence. Some would indeed benefit. At first, from the sudden abundance of unsecured food and the abrupt removal of traffic, control measures, noise, and direct persecution. But the long picture is more selective. Many so-called urban survivors do not merely tolerate us. They depend on us. Brown rats thrive where grain is stored. Waste is abundant, and warmth seeps from infrastructure. Pigeons descend from cliff-nesting rock doves, which helps explain why they find skyscrapers and bridges congenial. But their extraordinary densities in cities are sustained by human subsidy. Whether deliberate feeding or accidental provision, gulls gather around ports, fisheries, dumps, and parking lots because our leftovers became part of their ecology. Bed bugs rose with dense human habitation. Certain cockroach species are famously commensal, tied less to wilderness than to heated buildings. Plumbing and kitchens remove the people. And these species do not all inherit the earth in equal triumph. Some would surge briefly, then crash as the food pulse faded and infrastructure cooled. Others would retreat into smaller populations or shift back toward habitats that resemble their older ecological settings. Scavengers and predators offer a similar lesson. Around the world, many opportunistic animals have learned to live from our excess. Dumps, slaughter waste, roadkill, fish discards, crop residues, and suburban feeding create artificial concentrations of calories that reshape behavior and population size. Crows, gulls, jackals, foxes, raccoons, stray dogs, and many others have flourished in the margins of these subsidies. A humanless world would first release a huge, temporary stock of food, especially in stores, warehouses, feedlots, barns, and urban waste streams. Then it would begin to run out. The new equilibrium would depend on hunting ability, competition, disease, climate, and how quickly other ecological structures reorganized around the loss of the subsidy. The result would not be a simple march upward for all urban-adapted creatures. It would be a reshuffling. Domestic animals complicate this more than any public fantasy usually admits. Some would perish quickly because they have been bred so far from self-sufficiency that human care remains indispensable. Others would enter the ancient, uneasy process of fertilization. Pigs are among the clearest examples. Domestic pigs readily escape into feral life in many parts of the world, where they can spread rapidly, root up vegetation, alter soils, prey on smaller animals, and transform habitats. Goats, horses, cattle, and dogs have all done their own versions of this under the right conditions. Cats, already half inside and half outside human protection in many places, would continue hunting with consequences that could be severe for birds, reptiles, and small mammals, especially on islands or in fragmented habitats. A world without people would not be populated only by creatures returning from some deeper wilderness. It would also be populated by our former companions and livestock, carrying domestication back into the field. In that sense, the post-human landscape would contain an odd reversal. Some wild species that we pushed to the margins might expand. Some commensal species would shrink as our support vanished. Some domestic lineages would become a new invasive pressure. Even the language of wild and tame would start to blur. Ecologists and evolutionary biologists increasingly treat fertilization as more than a temporary nuisance or romantic return. It is a real process through which organisms shaped by human selection begin adapting again to freer and harsher conditions. The descendants of barnyard, stable, kennel, and house do not simply become what their ancestors once were. They become something historically new, carrying traces of domestication into ecological futures that did not previously exist. Plants, too, would reflect this hybrid inheritance. Abandoned croplands would pass through early succession, often beginning with weeds and opportunists adapted to disturbance, nutrient enrichment, and exposed soils. Ornamentals would escape gardens in some regions. Fruit trees and perennial crops could persist long after annual agriculture ended. Certain invasive species, already advantaged by transport, fragmentation, and human-created edge habitat, might dominate recovering ground. Urban heat islands, altered drainage, contaminated soils, and imported seed banks would favor some communities over others. If one could fly over continents a century after humanity's disappearance, the view might indeed be greener in many places. But the composition of that greenness would often be novel, assembled from old wounds, deliberate plantings, escaped cultivars, feral domestics, invasive pioneers, remnant natives, and climate-shifted migrants. Modern ecology has gradually developed language for this kind of world. Terms such as novel ecosystems entered debate because so many real landscapes no longer fit the older model of restoration toward a known historical baseline. Some scientists welcomed the term because it acknowledged reality. Others worried that it could become an excuse to lower conservation ambition or abandon damaged places too easily. Yet the argument itself is revealing. It shows how difficult it has become to imagine a universal target called restoration. Once history, colonization, domestication, climate alteration, and species movement have been taken seriously. The post-human Earth would not resolve that debate. It would intensify it. This is why a greener scene can be emotionally persuasive and scientifically misleading at the same time. Green suggests relief. It suggests growth, cover, moisture, shade, birds returning to branches, and roots holding soil again. All of that may be true. Yet ecological restoration is not a matter of color alone. It asks about composition, interaction, disturbance regime, trophic structure, the hydrology, extinction debt, invasive pressure, and historical legacies that may continue steering a place long after the visible marks of human occupancy have faded. To say that forests return is meaningful. To say that the old world is restored is something else. Perhaps the deepest change here is philosophical. The more closely scientists studied long land use histories, commensal species, fertilization, and managed habitats, the harder it became to preserve the old picture of humanity and nature as separate realms. Humans were never simply standing outside the living world, imposing themselves upon a passive stage. We were one of the agents through which environments were transformed, often destructively, sometimes unintentionally, occasionally in ways that increased local richness while decreasing it elsewhere, and nearly always in ways that made the future more contingent than our stories allowed. If humans disappeared, Earth would not finally become itself after ages of interruption. It would continue becoming through pathways already bent by our presence. And that brings the thought experiment to a more haunting threshold. A greener planet after us would still be carrying our instructions in its soils, its food webs, its feral descendants, its altered fire cycles, its drained wetlands, its moving species, and its remembered landscapes. Human absence would matter greatly, but absence would arrive late, after the world had already been rewritten in ways that no quick flush of vegetation could erase. From here, the final widening becomes unavoidable. If even the most visibly recovered future still grows from human-altered ecologies, then there remains one deeper question still waiting beneath everything we have seen. Beyond forests, beyond abandoned cities, beyond animals returning and domestic lineages running wild again, what traces of us would continue in the planet itself, in air, in water, in stone, and in the long memory of Earth after the species had gone? That deeper question begins where the eye can no longer be trusted on its own. A city can collapse, a field can green, a herd can cross an abandoned road, and all of it remains visible enough to hold the imagination. But some of the most enduring remains of a vanished civilization would not announce themselves in ruined skylines or ivy-covered walls. They would persist in the chemistry of the air, in the slow exchange between atmosphere and ocean, in the rearranged composition of sediments, in extinct lineages that never return, and in materials so novel and so widespread that future strata would remember them long after the last roof had fallen in. By the time the living surface seemed to be moving on, the deeper record would only just be beginning its long work of preservation. Climate science is one of the clearest places to feel that difference in timescale. For much of the 20th century, it was still possible for public discussion to imagine the atmosphere as something vast enough to absorb modern emissions without permanent consequence. Scientists, though, kept finding reasons to doubt that comfort. Svante Arrhenius had already calculated in the 19th century that changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide could alter global temperature. But the problem did not become truly planetary in the modern sense until geochemists, oceanographers, and atmospheric physicists began treating carbon as a global cycle rather than a local pollutant. By the mid-20th century, researchers such as Roger Revelle and Hans Suess were showing that the oceans would not simply soak up industrial carbon instantly and harmlessly. Then Charles David Keeling, with almost austere patience, started measuring atmospheric carbon dioxide with a regularity that turned abstraction into evidence. The Keeling curve matters here because it gave the invisible a shape. At Mauna Loa, year after year, the line rose. Seasonal breathing appeared in the data, but so did a larger climb that would not flatten. The atmosphere, once imagined as a boundless backdrop, became legible as an archive of industry. This changed the human disappearance thought experiment in a profound way. If all people vanished tomorrow, the smokestacks would stop, the engines would quiet, and new emissions would largely cease. Yet the carbon already placed into the system would not politely leave with us. Some of it would be taken up over years and decades by land and water. Some would persist far longer, redistributed through processes measured not in news cycles or political terms, but in centuries and millennia. The species could go missing faster than its greenhouse legacy. That long residence unsettles because it denies the fantasy of immediate absolution. The atmosphere would begin changing after human disappearance. Yes, but not by snapping back to some familiar baseline in a dramatic gesture of cleansing. Carbon dioxide declines on multiple timescales. Oceans absorb part of the burden. Forests and soils take part. Weathering and sedimentary processes continue their immense, patient work, yet a significant fraction lingers. Warming already set in motion does not evaporate in sympathy with our exit. Ice sheets, circulation patterns, sea level, marine chemistry, and ecological distributions all carry inertia. In this sense, a humanless future would still inhabit a human-shaped climate for a very long time. The oceans add another layer of delayed consequence. Long after fossil fuel combustion stopped, seawater would continue responding to the carbon transferred from air to water. Acidification, once a more specialized topic within marine chemistry, has become central because it shows how emissions alter life through pathways less obvious than temperature alone. Carbon dioxide dissolves, forms carbonic acid, shifts pH, and changes the availability of carbonate ions needed by many organisms for shells and skeletons. Coral reefs, planktonic organisms, mollusks, and many others live within that chemistry whether humans remain present or not. A world quieter on land could still contain stressed seas below its surface, holding the memory of combustion in altered carbonate balance. By this point in the story, the meaning of disappearance has changed almost completely. It no longer describes only the removal of an active force. It describes the persistence of consequences in systems that outlast intention. That change in meaning also shaped geology itself, especially in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. When some scientists began asking whether humanity had altered the Earth so thoroughly that the alteration deserved a name at the scale of epochs, the term Anthropocene, popularized by Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stormer, was more than a label of convenience. It was a challenge to inherited habits of thought. If human action had become stratigraphically legible, then humanity was not merely a historical agent. It had become, in a geological sense, a force. Few figures have pursued that implication more persistently than Jan Zalasiewicz and other members of the Anthropocene Working Group. Their work asked a deceptively simple question. If a geologist millions of years from now examined the layers corresponding to the recent human age, what would stand out? The answer was not only carbon, it was a whole assemblage of signals, many globally distributed and strangely synchronized. Fallout radionuclides from mid-20th century nuclear testing, plastics transported through soils, rivers, shorelines, and sediments, fly ash from fossil fuel combustion, concrete and aluminum at scales unknown in earlier history, chicken bones from industrial agriculture, novel minerals and manufactured compounds, a horizon of accelerated disturbance, unusually sharp in geological terms, seem to have appeared. This is where the humanless Earth becomes almost eerie. Cities may gradually collapse into rubble and soil. Steel may rust. Glass may shatter and disappear into fragments. Organic matter will rot or burn or be consumed. But some of the most characteristic products of industrial civilization are peculiarly durable, or at least peculiarly traceable. Plastics are the most famous because they combine everyday familiarity with long afterlife. They weather into smaller and smaller pieces, disperse widely, enter food webs, mix with beach sands and river muds, accumulate in sediments, and form a kind of distributed artifact field, unlike anything earlier civilizations produced. A broken amphora remains an object. Plastic often becomes a diffuse signature, woven into particulate environments at scales too small for ordinary historical imagination. Concrete has a different kind of persistence. It may crack, crumble, and be overgrown. But in sheer volume, it is one of the defining materials of the modern age. Entire coastlines, flood defenses, bridges, towers, apartment blocks, highways, tunnels, dams, and port facilities are expressions of limestone, clay, heat, water, steel, an aggregate reassembled by industrial process into new stone. Even as structures fail, their residues remain immense. Rubble becomes fill. Foundations remain as subsurface architectures. Altered topographies continue guiding drainage, slope stability, and soil formation. The future geologist would not need intact cities to know that something unusual had happened. The lithic signature alone would speak loudly. Radionuclides give the record a sharper temporal edge. Mid-century nuclear weapons testing distributed fallout globally, laying down a horizon that is unusually useful as a chronological marker. In a sense, this is one of the strangest legacies of all. For decades, humans argued over ideology, deterrence, sovereignty, prestige, and existential risk. The planet recorded the argument as a measurable layer. Future sediments would not preserve the speeches, but they may preserve the isotopic signal. And because that signal is so nearly worldwide, it lends the Anthropocene debate a certain empirical force. Human beings did not merely alter one valley here and one river there. They inscribed a planetary timestamp. Yet geology, like ecology, resists easy closure. The Anthropocene has been enormously influential as an idea, but its formal status remains disputed. Stratigraphers ask specific questions about boundary markers, correlation, permanence, and how formal units should be defined within the established geological timescale. Some researchers have argued strongly that the recent human transformation warrants formal recognition as a new epoch or series. Others accept the scale of the transformation while doubting that epoch is the right chronostratigraphic frame. Still others suggest that the phenomenon is better understood as an event, sharp and extraordinary, without requiring a new unit in the official hierarchy. The disagreement matters because it reminds us that even when evidence is dramatic, scientific naming is not merely a matter of cultural mood. It follows rules, traditions, and standards that can themselves become sites of intellectual conflict. That conflict is part of the beauty of science here. One can believe, reasonably, that modern humanity altered the Earth on a planetary scale and still disagree about how geology should formalize that insight. In fact, the disagreement may reveal something healthy. It keeps the concept from hardening too quickly into slogan. It asks researchers to distinguish between moral significance, political significance, ecological significance, and stratigraphic procedure. A humanless future would not settle that argument. It would simply continue depositing the evidence. There is another kind of residue that deserves attention because it is so easy to overlook while living inside it. Ours is a civilization intensely devoted to memory, or at least to storage. We write in clouds, on servers, in magnetic domains, on optical discs, solid-state drives, tapes, and distributed archives so vast that they give the impression of permanence through abundance alone. Yet preservation scientists and archivists have spent decades warning that digital memory is far more fragile than common intuition suggests. Media degrade. Formats become obsolete. Hardware disappears. Power fails. Cooling fails. Authentication système expire. Without institutions and maintenance, the great digital libraries of the present can become unreadable long before a stone inscription has lost its legibility. The irony is difficult to ignore. Clay tablets can wait 3,000 years in dry ground and still offer their marks. Paper, under the right conditions, can outlast political regimes. Acid-free archival practices were developed precisely because older records taught conservators how stubborn matter can be when treated well. But the digital world often survives only through active migration, duplication, validation, and continuous energy supply. This means a future without people could produce a peculiar asymmetry. The detailed self-description of modern civilization, stored in formats requiring living systems of care, might disappear faster than some of the waste products generated by that same civilization. Landfills may outlast databases. Plastic fragments may remain more legible to the earth than our photographs, films, messages, or scientific datasets. Extinction sharpens the record in yet another way, because it leaves behind absence rather than material abundance. When a species disappears, especially one lost through hunting, habitat conversion, invasive pressures, pollution, or climate disruption, there is no chemical residue neatly labeled with our name. Yet the biosphere keeps count through missing branches. A humanless world would still be a world without passenger pigeons, without great auks, without countless island birds, amphibians, mammals, insects, plants, and freshwater organisms already lost or sliding toward loss under pressures humans set in motion. No future regrowth can restore a lineage once it is gone. In this sense, one of our deepest traces is negative. It resides in the holes we punched through evolutionary history. The same is true of rearranged biogeography. Species transported around the globe by ships, trade, colonization, ballast water, agriculture, horticulture, and pet markets have been rewriting ecological maps for centuries. Some future habitats may flourish with life. Yet that life may be organized in combinations that would have been impossible before modern transport. A forest of the future may be dense, green, and acoustically rich while still expressing a human-forged distribution of species. A coastline may teem with introduced organisms that never would have reached it unaided. The visible abundance of the post-human Earth could therefore conceal a historical reassembly that remains ours in origin, even if no person is left to witness it. As the scales widen, one begins to see why the thought experiment exerts such power over scientists as well as storytellers. It asks about disappearance, but it ends by revealing a problem of persistence. What remains after intention ends. What continues after care is gone. What enters the long bookkeeping systems of air, water, sediment, isotope, lineage, and stone? The answer is not flattering, but neither is it simple condemnation. Human beings were never merely destroyers passing across a passive globe. They were matter moving, energy releasing, species shifting, chemistry altering organisms whose activities became unusually concentrated through technology, extraction, and global coordination. The Earth did not stand outside that activity. It registered it continuously. Perhaps that is why the most haunting version of a future geology is not one in which our ruins stand intact for millions of years. They will not. Tectonics, erosion, weathering, burial, and biological activity will do what they always do. The haunting possibility is quieter than that. It is that long after the cities themselves have dissolved into fragments. The strata may still hold enough of our signature to indicate that something singular occurred here. A pulse of carbon, a plastic horizon, a radionuclide marker, a biotic turnover, an extraordinary abundance of concrete, aluminum, and manufactured compounds. A brief interval in which one species rearranged the face of the Earth and then was gone. To imagine that future is to feel a strange reversal in the hierarchy of memory. We usually think of remembrance as a cultural act, something held in minds, books, monuments, rituals, and archives. Geology reminds us that memory can also be impersonal. The planet keeps records without caring whether anyone can read them. Sediments settle, isotopes decay, fossils form or fail to form, chemical anomalies persist, shorelines shift. A future intelligence, if one ever studied these layers, might infer from them the broad outline of our existence. But even if no intelligence ever did, the record would still be there. The Earth does not require an audience to remember. And that, perhaps, is the quiet final turn of the question we began with. We started by imagining an empty street, a weed in the curb, the release of pressure, the beautiful lie that the world would simply revert to itself once people were gone. We arrive instead at a far more difficult vision. The world would continue. Yes, it would green in places, collapse in others, shift, diversify, narrow, redistribute, weather, drown, dry, and move onward in forms no single story can contain. But beneath all that movement, it would go on carrying our mark in ways both visible and invisible, brief and immense, fragile and nearly indelible. The deepest afterlife of our species would not be the skyline. It would be the layer. By the end of this journey, the old fantasy has changed shape. A humanless Earth is no longer just a picture of empty streets, climbing vines, and distant animal calls. It is a more difficult vision, and perhaps a more honest one. We have seen that the world would not simply slide back into some earlier innocence. It would pass through failure, imbalance, recovery, distortion, and long memory. Some of what we built would fall quiet almost at once. Some of it would remain dangerous in our absence, and some of the deepest marks we have made would persist in forms no eye could easily see. In carbon lingering in air and ocean, in rearranged ecologies, in residues buried layer by layer into the planet itself. That understanding changes more than this one thought experiment. It changes the way we see our place in nature. Humans are not only creatures moving across the earth, leaving temporary footprints behind. We are also a force that has held certain systems in place, interrupted others, accelerated some processes, delayed others, and written ourselves into landscapes so thoroughly that even our disappearance would not fully erase the sentence. Science, at its best, has a quiet way of doing this to the mind. It takes an image that once felt simple and opens it into a deeper, stranger truth. And perhaps that is part of what makes questions like this worth asking. Not because we expect to vanish, and not because the world without us is somehow purer or more meaningful than the world with us, but because following the question carefully teaches us to see more clearly what is already here. The work of curiosity is often like that. It begins with an image, a fear, a fantasy, or a simple piece of wonder. And if we stay with it long enough, it returns us to reality with better eyes, somewhere ahead. Other scientists will keep reading the air, the soil, the ruins, the archives, and the stone. And through them, the search to understand what a human world really is and what it leaves behind will continue.